My name is Barbara Agnes Barker. I work in the Aboriginal Resource Office at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. I am Mi'kmaq and Innu through my grandmother, Agnes John. She was a John of Conn River, or Meowpukek. We left Conn River, a long time ago, my family, and we went to Glenwood. And so most of my ancestors are actually buried in Glenwood in an Indian graveyard there, because they were not welcome to be buried with the rest of the community. I've been to that graveyard. It's a very beautiful place to rest forever. And so after Glenwood, my family moved into Grand Falls, which is where I was born and raised, and where my grandmother, Agnes John, who is my namesake, and I always say Barbara Agnes because my grandmother means so much to me. And so yeah, that's who I am. And on my mother's side of the family, we are Irish. My title is the Coordinator for Aboriginal Cultural Education. And some of that is just support to students one-on-one. Of course, in my title, I have an educational role here in the university. So working with individual classes as a guest lecturer, bringing in Aboriginal peoples from across Canada to our university to speak to our students, to have different kinds of presentations, may it be art or culture or lecturing of that nature. Anywhere on campus where I can supplement the educational traditional tools we have. You think about Western culture, settler culture. My role is really to help indigenize the academy. That's a large thing. What does that really mean practically? I'm figuring that out all the time on my job. And so through the other lens, the duality of what does it mean to decolonize a university. So those are kind of the forefront of the questions that I'm always working with within the institution. And with the supports we have here, the Aboriginal Resource Office, we report to the Special Advisor, to the President on Aboriginal Affairs. Catherine Anderson is my boss, essentially, and I feel very lucky to be working within the structures. We've had changes recently at Memorial where this office was a part of kind of a student structure, and now we're I think it's a good growing moment for this office to be a part of Aboriginal Affairs, to kind of be in line with the Special Advisor and our role to kind of be supporting each other within this university environment, instead of this office, for example, being isolated from some of that discourse.
In regards to the programs or the services that you provide, the target audience and the groups that come to you for support, can you tell us a bit about who you support?
Primarily, we have Aboriginal students coming through our doors. And so in Newfoundland, we have our own Aboriginal students. So our Mi'kmaq students, our Innu, our Inuit, they're who are in our lounge usually. We provide support to the university en masse when it comes to what does it mean, Aboriginal education. People come to me with very basic questions. The very beginning of research, like I had, for example, a master's student just writing, I did some research in Fogo, whose traditional territory is that? So people start with really basic questions, and then also like the audience is the university en masse. We're doing things all the time trying to get anyone within the university population to recognize the importance of the kind of knowledge that Aboriginal peoples hold and the value of it in Western curriculum, and how supporting our Aboriginal students can hopefully build towards an environment where we have Indigenous scholars here on campus, elders as a part of the curriculum. What does it mean in the academy to make space for traditional knowledge holders? Within our communities, those are the people who have the PhDs, for example. And so having that kind of knowledge really valued in a university environment. So we're working with our students all the time, but our students are all part of the larger kind of push to make Indigenous knowledge, Aboriginal education, valued for everyone in Canadian society, not just for our Aboriginal communities. I think making space for our elders in our classroom is vital. I think I get asked lots of the time, for conferences, can you bring an elder? Can we have someone who has traditional knowledge be a part of the discussion? And I know people want those people there, but I'm not always finding the funding to have people there. So I think the more we can carve out space in our university environment to, I know other universities across Canada are doing this, and I see it happening very soon here at Memorial. I think hopefully we'll start it with a visiting elders program, so we'll be able to have different elders from different communities across Newfoundland and Labrador coming to our university environment for a number of days and participating in the education of our students in a number of different ways. So I think that's a sign of excellence. Having a permanent structure for elders to be a part of campus on a regular basis is a sign of excellence, definitely, in achieving for our campus a goal, I think personally within this office, something we're working really very hard towards. I think excellence in the classroom is also finding places in the curriculum to have Aboriginal voices. I think one of the problems we're facing right now in Canada is not seeing the value in bringing outside perspectives into the curriculum. So we have kind of a culture with norms, and within those norms in Canada, the basis of it really is, I'm trying to say this as politely as possible, but like our normal culture in Canada, the taken for granted norms we have are kind of built on a particular voice or point of view. And so we have an opportunity now within Canadian society to bring in other voices and points of view. And if we do that and present, Indigenous education, for example, with our elders as just as an important point of view as someone who has their PhD, that Canadian society can move past some of the assumptions and really dangerous stereotypes that we use to colonize Canada, essentially. The things at the basics of colonization were lies and stories that settlers told themselves to make sense of the violence that they were a part of in Aboriginal communities, in taking land, in policy and law, essentially, that oppressed Indigenous peoples in Canada, so the resources in the land could be used here by settler society. And so if we're going to really, as a Canadian society, make space for alternative points of view, to have those voices, those Indigenous voices around the table, I think we have to face that colonial truth, that denial we're still kind of in. Colonialism is current, it's not historic. And we see it happening, for example, in our criminal justice system really pervasively right now in Canada. Indigenous people are sentenced to longer sentences than anyone else in Canada. There's extreme examples of isolation than within the jails themselves. So Indigenous people particularly being in experiences of solitary confinement is the word I'm looking for. And so you've got that side of the coin, and then the other side of the coin you've got seemingly Indigenous lives when we have people before the court system who are accused of crimes. We're seeing Indigenous families and communities not really getting justice through that process. And then you look at our numbers of Aboriginal children in care. So we don't need to think about colonialism as being historic when we look at the number of Aboriginal children being in care. And I can't help but bring up little beautiful Tina Fontaine, okay? The notion that she was removed from her community because that was in her best interest. And now is the time in Canada to really think about that what are we saying about Canada if we can legitimately look at ourselves in the mirror and say that Tina Fontaine was better off being removed from her family and we all know what comes next, ending up being in a hotel and her murder. But like, Tina Fontaine is one of thousands of children, tens of thousands of children across Canada. And so if we don't face the lies we tell ourselves, that that child was better being removed from her community, then we're going to have a hard time really moving forward as a society that Indigenous people have more control over their own lives, that we are thriving in our own communities, so that our children are not spending day to day in Canada just trying to survive. Because Indigenous people in Canada right now are largely trying to survive. And so where do we go to? A university setting. So we've got Indigenous, young adults in university. We've got older Indigenous people coming back to university. Indigenous women in particular are getting educated across Canada. And so we've got to take from what we know is happening in our communities and have leadership in a university environment. And the more we can educate our own Aboriginal youth to, be able to
Empowered?
Yeah, thrive in this setting as well, like thrive in the Western kind of academic or whatever, doctors, nurses, social workers, lawyers. The more our numbers are empowered in Western society, while not forgetting any of our knowledge systems that kind of predate all the violence that kind of showed up here and has had long-lasting implications, but we are still here. And so I don't want the sad realities of trying to survive to not be balanced with the tremendous amount of good work happening in Aboriginal communities all across Canada, independent of the systemic inequalities and the actual structural oppression that is still happening. So there's tremendous amount of wonderful things happening despite those things. So, being empowered by that alone, that knowledge, I think really allows us to go into, I think, education. Like, I left my particular previous job because I found so much hope and promise in the idea of education. And so I think the more we are educated in our own traditions, in our own knowledge systems, in our own ways of being in the world, and bring those things to Western kind of settler society, the more we will all benefit. Because, Aboriginal people, I talked about trying to survive in Canada, it's not only Aboriginal people that are disadvantaged by the state structure. I think Aboriginal people have a unique, important story that is different than ways we find other people oppressed in society. But the narratives that Aboriginal people can bring to Western ways of being and thinking and living in the world, I think can create improvement for all walks of society. I think one example we saw out of the Colton Boushie case and the white jury is, if we could change, and that's a very small, example. I think maybe perhaps the criminal justice system in lots of ways is doing a lot of disservices to lots of different communities. We might want to think of how Aboriginal communities can exist in their own kind of narratives of justice outside the justice system that we know. But bearing that in mind, people talked about the jury selection process and how it essentially allowed for anyone who was racialized to be filtered out of the process. So you're left with this, so to speak, all-white jury. It's not only racialized people who are disadvantaged from that jury selection process. Women who have been sexually assaulted often are disadvantaged by the jury selection process because women can be filtered out of the jury as well. So I think that's one really concrete, simple, minute example where the work being done by Aboriginal communities to say, this is a really terrible piece of, judicial power within the criminal justice system. We should change this piece of law in the criminal code. But lots of people would benefit from it. So that's just my example. Like, equality lifts us all. And so if we make space for Aboriginal ways of knowing and being and living in the world, I think that we could transform the way our institutions are doing things right now, and it's not only Aboriginal communities that would benefit from really the isolation and the alienation that we're kind of all experiencing in crisis as a society right now. The alarm is going. We're at a turning point when we even look at climate change happening right now, and it's Indigenous people worldwide who are doing the work on climate change in their communities. And so, we're at a breaking point, and I have all the faith in the world that the more our Aboriginal kids get the opportunity to finish high school, get the opportunity to go to university, get the opportunity to be in positions of power in our institutions, in our government, in everyday ways in our communities, the more our communities are going to be improved for Aboriginal people and for the Canadian society overall. It's not working for Aboriginal people, but Canadian society is, in my opinion, not working for lots of different people. And the only challenge we have right now is, the uncomfortable work of facing a structure, that works well for some people and only a very small group of people. And, to dissettle or to unsettle those existing structures is going to be difficult because people don't want to give up their positions of privilege and power. But the more voices we have around the table, the harder it's going to be for those systems to stay in place, because just by the sheer volume of alternative points of view, I have hope that maybe some of those things will start to change. The university is starting to think, Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador is starting to think about what is its relationship to the Indigenous people of the province. Because Newfoundland and Labrador, this Memorial University talks about a special relationship to our citizens of the province, okay, because we're the only university in Newfoundland and Labrador, so we have this special role to our own young minds and communities or whatnot. Well, a part of that narrative now is we're starting to think, well, what is within that obligation to our Indigenous communities, and how can our university show that we value the education and the knowledge in our Aboriginal communities? How can we think about ways to make the university campus kind of a microcosm of larger society, and teach the history and the reality of colonization, but also think about what we can do as members of Newfoundland, members of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, to have Aboriginal ways of knowing and being, not kind of isolated. We're the Aboriginal Resource Office, but I'd like for Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador to not just have this office that deals with Aboriginal issues, to have space in the whole entire university curriculum to have the benefit of Aboriginal ways of knowing and being. So right now we're a little office, but I see the great potential for our work to be broadened, essentially, to get to a point where it would be automatic for people to always have an Indigenous perspective in their curriculum, rather than us always having to say, have you thought about getting your students to read an Indigenous author? Have you thought about having an elder in to speak about this particular issue? We'll be there to support the university along that process, but the goal is ultimately for the university to see the value in it, so that it kind of continues on its own and doesn't always have to be encouraged, to foster an environment that understands the value of those things. I really hope across Canada, as we really look at the notion of indigenizing the academy and decolonizing spaces, that we do that with sincerity and with a humbleness, that it's not simply for window dressing, that we don't have drumming or have our Indigenous students in particular moments when it looks good on camera or when we're trying to get funding for a particular project. I really hope that by supporting our Indigenous students to really thrive and achieve their goals within society, that it's done at an institutional level, that we change our ways of thinking that are broad and not just surface based. That we really work. We have a bit of a unique situation in Newfoundland and Labrador that we don't have a lot of our own Indigenous scholars leading in our university setting. So I really hope we support our Indigenous students to thrive in their studies so that we have people with their masters and their PhD and also our elders, all working within the university environment, because until we really have a focused number of scholars throughout our institutions leading in our as doctors and lawyers, like not just within the academy, unless we're really going to address the systemic inequality that is still fundamentally at the core of all of our institutions and systems in Canada, then we're not going to be able to support our students to really thrive. And so a part of decolonizing the academy, a part of indigenizing the academy is making space within our universities by being honest about the systemic inequality kind of structurally built into our processes, and then changing those processes and allowing our Aboriginal students to thrive. And at that point, I think we'll see true change within the academy, because when we have numbers, when we're teaching, when we're out in different parts of society being leaders, I think that's kind of when we'll have inevitable change, that there'll be voices around the table that say, have you ever thought about how this policy really is presuming a certain kind of taken for granted life, and maybe if you thought about this perspective and this perspective and this perspective, you'd be able to have a policy that's really more fair when we're looking at how we're going to, for example, choose people within a particular program or whatever. If we don't support our Aboriginal students at the very basics of getting them into their first year of university, making sure they have all the support so they can thrive, then we're not really going to have an opportunity for fairness. Right now in Canadian society, I would suggest fairness is not the same thing for everyone, because white supremacy is still at the core of all of our institutions. So unless we name that, I fear it'll be window dressing, because the Canadian state has said lots of great things after different commissions about how it's going to be new and different for Indigenous people in Canada. But my hope is not in the state saying, okay, well, this is really terrible and we're going to fix it. It's more, we're going to empower our Indigenous students to go out and take over those institutions, and they're going to fix it. So I have great hope for Aboriginal education, because I have tremendous amount of hope when I look at the Aboriginal youth of Canadian society. You talk about powerhouses. There are people across Canada doing formidable work in all areas of our communities when it comes to Indigenous education and excellence in Indigenous education, because the idea of Indigenous education is not narrow. It's very broad. Our education is in our conversations with our community members. It's in learning about the stories of our particular families. It's in about, going to the Western systems and becoming an expert in whatever your field is. And so, maybe white supremacy is as old as, colonization, but our Indigenous youth are going to change the world, and it's coming. And our population, our birth rates, it's going to be inevitable. So I just can't wait. We're kind of at this pivotal moment where I think in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the more Indigenous kids we have going out into the world, in Mi'kmaq ways of having two-eyed seeing, of being, experts in their own community, in their own knowledge systems, and experts in the Western world, watch out, because everything's going to change.